With me this morning are MSNBC legal analyst, former U.S. attorney in Alabama and co-host of the podcast Sisters-in-Law, Joyce Vance, and former federal prosecutor and host of the Justice Matters podcast, Glenn Kirshner. Good morning to both of you, my good friends. Glenn, let's start with you. That breaking committee news from last night about Rudy Giuliani. Why do you think Rudy finally decided to testify when so many of Trump's inner circle said, peace out, not going to do it, and especially after Rudy said that he would not do it if it wasn't going to be recorded?
Yeah, Katie, I don't know whether there is a cause and effect at play, but what have we learned in recent days? The Department of Justice has requested all of the transcripts from the January 6th committee for the 1,000 plus witnesses that have appeared before the committee and provided testimony. So all of a sudden, what do we learn? We learn that Bill Barr has apparently agreed to talk to the committee. And now we know that Rudy Giuliani has testified to the committee for 9 hours. Is there a cause and effect at play here? You know, there may be. But I will tell you the one thing that surprises me most about Rudy Giuliani having testified is that he did it at all, because I fully expected he would continue to offer privileges, whether legitimate or otherwise. He might have some legitimate attorney-client privilege claims with respect to information involving his representation of Donald Trump. He could try to assert an executive privilege claim, though I think that would be weak. But there is one privilege claim that he absolutely has. It's a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, because we know he is still under criminal investigation by the Southern District of New York after a federal judge issued a warrant concluding there was probable cause to believe there was evidence of crime in Rudy's electronic devices. So I don't know what the substance of his testimony was yesterday, but I would be surprised if he didn't try to assert a whole bunch of privileges.
I would also have been surprised if it was lucid and competent. So, Joyce, the Washington Post is reporting that Justice Clarence Thomass's wife, Ginny Thomas, pressed Arizona lawmakers after the 2020 election to set aside the popular vote victory for Joe Biden and select a, quote, clean slate of electors. This is according to emails obtained by the Washington Post. Joyce, we already know about those Mark Meadows texts. Why is this not news enough, new news enough, to put Ginny Thomas in an interview seat to have to answer questions?
It should put Ginny Thomas in that interview seat, probably from the committee, certainly from the Justice Department. But, Katie, we live in this real world where there are sensitivities surrounding Supreme Court justices and their families. And I think it will be difficult, quite frankly, for people to navigate these issues where, in fact, it should be simple. Because if Ginny Thomas was anyone else with the sort of knowledge she's displayed on multiple issues, investigators would sit down and have a chat with her. Not necessarily that she's a target for investigation, but they would want to know what she knows. And most importantly here is this incredible coincidence that she's out pushing this same scheme that we know ultimately comes to fruition among those closest to Trump, this scheme to create blank slates of electors who aren't the choice of the people, but who instead are pansies for the former president, people who are supposed to go in and do his work for him. And that's a little bit too close for comfort, that coincidence. So that warrants further investigation.
And, Joyce, your point's important, right? It's not just the insurrectionists and the events leading up to January 6th. It's, you know, this slate of electors. It's not just the violence, but it's a violence on paper of disarming the vote for the people. Glenn, I want to stay on this issue of Justice Thomas. In recent comments, he has blamed the erosion of trust in the Supreme Court on the recent Roe draft leak. In light of these continuous revelations of his wife's repeated and extensive involvement in January 6th, shouldn't Chief Justice Roberts bench Clarence Thomas from, at the very least, any cases dealing with the insurrection or the 2020 election?
He should, but as Joyce said, the simple answers are not often the answers we seem to pursue. I believe we tend to overthink these things. Now, does the Chief Justice have the power, the authority to bench one of the other justices? Probably not, strictly speaking. But I think if Chief Justice Roberts takes seriously the eroding trust that the American people have in the Supreme Court and the confidence that it can sort of rise above partisan politics and do its job of dispensing justice equally and fairly on behalf of the American people, then he better do something, because Congress doesn't really have a lot of power when it comes to, installing regulations or rules governing Supreme Court justice behavior. It's really up to the Supreme Court itself to police its own misbehavior or bad actors. And thus far, it's fallen down on the job. And I think Chief Justice Roberts better try to do whatever he can do to try to shore up the public's perception of the legitimacy of the Supreme Court.
So, Joyce, new reports indicate that former Attorney General Bill Barr may testify before the committee. We talked about it in the intro into the segment. What do you think Barr would be willing to tell the committee? And frankly, how self-serving do you think that testimony would end up being?
It will likely be enormously self-serving. Barr knows that the one path forward that he can't take is to completely flout the committee's authority, because that's the one path forward that gets folks in trouble with the Justice Department, his former employer. It's important to remember that as the Attorney General, he was not the president's lawyer. There's no sort of attorney-client relationship. He might have executive privileges that he would be able to assert. But what you're interested in hearing from Bill Barr is, why did you leave when you did? Remember, he left just a few days before Christmas, saying he wanted to spend more time with his family at a point in the year where DOJ virtually shuts down for those last couple of weeks, and people, in fact, go home to take that time with their families. So that never rang true. The other issue that Bill Barr, if he's forthcoming, could provide a lot of information on would be President Trump's state of mind, because Barr was one of the officials who said, "We've looked, no fraud involved in this election." And of course, a central issue is whether Trump understood that there was no fraud and continued to try to hang on to power. Bill Barr, if he wanted to, could shed a lot of light on that. But it's unlikely that we'll hear much in the way of actual apparent truth from the former Attorney General. He has too much invested in the persona that he's created, his ties to folks who are on the Trump side of the equation. I think he'll try to tap dance a straight line up the middle.
You know, Glenn, the January 6th committee, it has been busy. The other news that we just talked about concerns Georgia Representative Barry Loudermilk. We don't know if the January 6th committee actually has evidence of Congressman Loudermilk giving the tour, but he released a statement. And let's be clear, it wasn't a denial. He released a statement about giving a tour to a family. But we know that the committee's been really diligent in its investigation. The pace seems to be picking up. We've got the public hearings coming up in June. Does this news about Loudermilk lead you to believe, Glenn, that there's actually more to the story about these tours?
You know, there clearly is some there, Katie, because remember, about 16 months ago, Congressman Loudermilk issues a statement saying, "I gave no reconnaissance tours." And then when he seems to be caught, at least based on the January 6th committee's assertion that we've got the tapes, we've got the goods, and we want you to come in and interview with us, he issues another statement. He says, "Well, I gave a tour on January 5th, the day before, but trust me, it was on the up and up. It was just a constituent family." I don't know if that's a euphemism for insurrectionist, but perhaps we'll find out. But why did he hide for 16 months the fact that at a time the protocols for COVID had the Capitol shut down to these kinds of tours? He felt compelled to give one on January 5th and then hide that fact for 16 months. The only remaining question is, will he continue to conceal relevant information from the committee, or will he comply with the committee's request and actually testify?